The first thing people notice about me is that I don't raise my voice. I've spent 12 years working in neonatal intensive care, where panic doesn't save babies and shouting never fixes a crisis. Tiny lungs don't care how frightened you are. Fragile hearts don't respond to anger. They respond to calm hands, steady decisions, and someone who refuses to give up. Somewhere along the way, I became that person everywhere else in my life too. My name is Oilia Owens. I'm 34 years old, a neonatal intensive care nurse in Dayton, Ohio, and until 3 weeks after my daughter was born. I believed that being the dependable one was something to be proud of. I know better now. 3 weeks after giving birth to Nora, I stood barefoot in my own kitchen with her sleeping against my shoulder while my mother calmly informed me that it was time for me to leave my own home. She didn't ask. She didn't suggest. She announced it as though she were reading tomorrow's weather forecast. "Brent needs the house more than you do," she said. There wasn't a trace of cruelty in her voice. That was what made it hurt even more. She honestly believed she was being reasonable. "You'll find another place," she continued while stirring sugar into her coffee. "You're strong, Oilia. You always figure things out." I remember looking down at Nora's tiny fingers curled around the strap of my nursing tank and wondering if exhaustion was making me hallucinate. I had slept maybe 2 hours the night before. Surely I couldn't have heard my own mother correctly. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "What did you just say?" She sighed the same way she'd sighed when I was 16 and forgot to thaw chicken for dinner. I said Brent and Kayla need somewhere stable after the foreclosure. The children deserve consistency. They'll move in next month. She glanced toward the hallway. The nursery will make a lovely room for Mason. I stared at her. The nursery. The room I'd painted pale blue 6 months earlier. The room where every tiny sleeper had been folded by size. The room where I'd spent entire evenings sitting in a rocking chair imagining what my daughter's laugh might sound like. She was talking about it as though it already belonged to someone else. "My bedroom?" I asked quietly. "You can take a rental," she answered without hesitation. "A small apartment is easier for one person anyway." One person. As if the warm little life sleeping on my shoulder didn't count. As if Nora and I were temporary guests instead of the owners of the house. The silence stretched between us. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, the white noise machine in the nursery continued playing gentle ocean waves. Everything about the morning felt painfully ordinary, except my entire world had tilted. Finally, I managed one sentence. "This is my house." She looked at me with the patient expression she'd worn for most of my life. "Oh, Oilia," she said. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Looking back now, I realized that moment wasn't really about the house. It was about 34 years of conditioning finally colliding with one undeniable truth. My family had never seen me as someone who could say no. I had been the responsible daughter for so long that they mistook responsibility for obedience. There's a difference. I just hadn't learned it yet. Growing up, my younger brother Brent was the center of every room he entered. He wasn't a bad person. He was simply everyone's favorite. He was charming, funny, athletic. The kind of kid teachers remembered years later. I was the dependable one. The daughter who remembered birthdays. The daughter who stayed home with dad after surgery. The daughter who worked weekends without complaining. If Brent forgot Mother's Day, everyone laughed because that's just Brent. If I forgot to call for one evening, someone inevitably asked whether I was becoming selfish. Funny how different children can grow up in the same house under entirely different rules. By the time I reached nursing school, I barely questioned it anymore. I worked double shifts at a diner, graduated with honors, finished clinical rotations running on caffeine and 4 hours of sleep. When my nursing pinning ceremony finally arrived, I'd secretly hoped my family would surprise me. Instead, my mother called the night before. "We won't make it," she'd explained. "Brent has an important baseball tournament." I smiled into the phone. "No problem." Then I cried in my car after hanging up. Not because they weren't coming, because some part of me had expected them to. That hopeful little girl inside me refused to learn, even after all those years. Everything changed the day I bought my house. At 28, signing those mortgage papers felt impossible. My hands shook so badly that the closing attorney smiled and asked if it was my first home. "It is," I admitted. "Then enjoy this moment," he said. "You'll remember it forever." He was right. I remember every second. The empty living room. The smell of fresh paint. The echo of my footsteps. The folding chair I'd borrowed because I couldn't yet afford furniture. The frozen pizza I ate sitting on the hardwood floor. I'd never felt rich in my life. That night, I owned exactly one folding chair, a mattress on the floor, and enough savings to survive maybe 3 months if everything went wrong. But for the first time in my life, everything belonged to me. No one could tell me to leave. No one could decide where I lived. No one could take away the one thing I'd built entirely on my own. Or so I believed. The next morning my neighbor knocked. Miss Dolores Johnson. Everyone called her Miss D. She carried a cast iron pan wrapped carefully in towels. "I brought cornbread," she announced before I'd even opened the screen door all the way. I laughed. "You don't even know me, honey," she replied, stepping inside. "Women who buy houses by themselves deserve cornbread." That became the beginning of one of the most important friendships of my life. She never pried. Never judged. She simply watched. And every now and then she'd offer one sentence that stayed with me for years. The first one came while we sat on my front porch, eating warm cornbread straight from the pan. She looked at the little colonial I'd worked so hard to buy. Then she smiled. "A house," she said softly, "doesn't just protect you from the weather. It shows everybody exactly where your boundaries begin." At the time, I thought she was talking about fences. There are moments in life that don't feel important while they're happening. A phone call. A passing comment. A casual sentence spoken over coffee. Only later do you realize that was the exact moment your future quietly changed direction. For me, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while Nora slept against my chest. My phone buzzed. Brent. That alone surprised me. My brother rarely called unless he needed something. Birthdays were usually text messages. Christmas gifts often arrived late, if they arrived at all. Yet somehow, he always found time when life backed him into a corner. "Hey, sis." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "How's my favorite niece?" I smiled despite everything. "Sleeping. They do that a lot." "Huh, they do?" There was an awkward pause. Then he cleared his throat. "So Mom talked to you yet?" The warmth disappeared from my chest. "About what?" Another pause. "The house." I closed my eyes. "So you already knew?" "I mean," he hesitated. "We've been talking about it for a couple weeks." A couple weeks. While I was recovering from childbirth. While I was learning how to feed my daughter every 2 hours. While I was sitting awake at 3 a.m. wondering if every tiny sound Nora made was normal. They had been planning to move into my house. Without ever asking me. "You discussed where my baby would sleep," I said quietly, before anyone thought to mention it to me. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like." He sighed. "Kayla's been under a lot of stress. So have I. Our kids need stability." I looked down at Nora. "So does mine." Silence. Finally, Brent spoke again. "You've always landed on your feet." There it was. The family motto. Not, "How can we help?" Not, "What do you need?" Just confidence that somehow I would absorb another sacrifice. I'd spent so many years proving I could survive impossible situations that nobody stopped asking me to survive one more. "I'm not leaving my house." He laughed. Actually laughed. "You don't have to make everything dramatic." Dramatic. I had stitches that still hurt when I stood too quickly. I hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in weeks. Milk stains covered every shirt I owned. Yet somehow protecting the roof over my newborn daughter's head was dramatic. "I'm hanging up now. Will ya?" The click. For several minutes I simply sat in the nursery rocking chair while rain tapped softly against the windows. Nora stretched in her sleep, making one tiny sigh that somehow calmed every storm inside me. She had no idea adults complicated everything. To her, the world was simple. Warm arms, a full belly, a familiar heartbeat, safety. I kissed the top of her tiny head. "I've got you," I whispered. The words surprised me, not because I meant them, because for the first time in my life, I realized no one else was going to protect us. If I didn't, nobody would. The following Sunday after church, My mother's sisters arrived without warning. Aunt Ruth, Aunt Denise, my cousin Elaine, 3 casseroles, 1 pie, and enough opinions to fill the house before anyone removed their coats. They surrounded Nora with smiles and compliments. "Oh, she's beautiful. She has your father's eyes. Such perfect little fingers." For 20 peaceful minutes, everything felt normal. Then Aunt Ruth casually asked, "So, when are Brent and the children moving in?" I nearly dropped my coffee. I looked at my mother. She carefully buttered a dinner roll without looking up. The conversation had already spread through the family. Everyone knew, except the owner of the house. "I'm sorry." Aunt Ruth frowned. "Carol said you were helping Brent get back on his feet." Mom finally looked up. "We are." "No," she corrected herself. "You are." I stared at her. She smiled politely. As we discussed. We didn't discuss anything. The dining room became very quiet. Even the children in the backyard seemed to stop shouting. Carol folded her napkin with perfect precision. "I don't understand why you're embarrassing me." Embarrassing her. Not trying to evict me. Not assigning my daughter's nursery to another child. Me. I was embarrassing her. "I bought this house." "You bought it for family?" "No." My voice remained calm. "I bought it because I worked every holiday for 6 years. Aunt Denise shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, girls." Mom raised one hand. "You don't understand sacrifice yet because you're still young." I almost laughed. 34 years old. Registered nurse. Homeowner mother. Apparently still too young to understand my own life. "I understand sacrifice." I looked directly into her eyes. "I've been making it for this family since I was 12. Nobody spoke. For one brief second, I actually thought someone might agree with me. Instead, Brent leaned back in his chair. "We're all making sacrifices." "No," I answered. "You're making plans. They're not the same thing." That evening, Rosa came over carrying Thai takeout. She took one look at my face. What happened? I told her everything. Every word. Every conversation. Every impossible expectation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her fork. "Can I ask you something?" "Sir, if Nora grows up." She nodded toward the bassinet. "And somebody treats her exactly the way your family treats you," Titan. I felt my stomach tighten. "What would you tell her?" The answer came instantly. "To leave." She nodded. "So why is it different for you?" "Because they're family." The words reached my throat, then stopped. Were they family? Of course they were. But family wasn't supposed to mean endless permission. Family wasn't supposed to require one person to disappear so everyone else could stay comfortable. Rosa smiled gently. "You've confused being loved with being useful." I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew she was right. 3 days later, I came home from a pediatrician appointment. Someone had moved furniture. Not all of it. Just enough to make my skin crawl. The rocking chair in the nursery had been pushed into another corner. The changing table had been shifted against the opposite wall. The closet door stood open. Several empty hangers swung slowly back and forth. I walked downstairs. "Mum." She appeared carrying folded towels. "Oh," she smiled. I was just seeing where Mason's bed might fit. I stared at her. "You rearranged my baby's room." I was measuring. "You had no permission." "Oh, Oilia." She laughed softly. "You make everything sound so dramatic." For the first time in my life, I didn't doubt myself. I didn't apologize. I didn't wonder if maybe I was overreacting. Instead, I walked upstairs, moved every piece of furniture exactly where it belonged, closed the closet, locked the nursery door. Then I slipped the only key into my pocket. Standing beside Nora's crib, I suddenly understood something Miss D had tried to teach me years earlier. A house doesn't just have walls. It has boundaries. And boundaries mean absolutely nothing, unless someone is willing to defend them. The next Monday was my first day, back at the hospital for a short orientation before returning to regular shifts. Leaving Nora for the first time felt like someone had reached into my chest and removed a piece of me. I checked the diaper bag 3 times, then the bottles, then the emergency contact list. By the time I reached the front door, my mother sighed dramatically. "Oilia, she's staying with her grandmother, not a stranger." "I know." "You've checked everything 5 times?" "I know." Carol smiled as she lifted Nora from my arms. "Go save those tiny babies. I'll take care of this one." For a second, I believed her. I kissed Nora's forehead, whispered that Mommy would be home soon, and drove to the hospital trying not to cry. Walking back into the NICU felt strangely comforting. The familiar beeping monitors, the quiet conversations, the controlled chaos. Here, problems had solutions. When alarms sounded, everyone worked together. Nobody expected one exhausted person to carry the entire unit. By lunchtime, I realized how much I'd missed it. Even so, every spare moment I found myself checking my phone. No missed calls. No emergencies. Just pictures from my mother, Nora sleeping, Nora yawning, Nora wearing the little yellow sleeper I'd bought before she was born. Everything looked perfectly normal. I relaxed. That turned out to be a mistake. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, something felt off. It wasn't obvious. Nothing was broken. Nothing looked damaged. But after 12 years of reading tiny changes in critically ill newborns, I'd learned to trust instincts that couldn't yet explain themselves. Miss D was watering flowers across the street. The moment she saw my car, she waved me over. "You got a minute?" I walked across the lawn. "Everything okay?" She hesitated. I wasn't sure whether to mention it. My stomach tightened. "Mention what? There was a moving truck here today." I frowned. "A moving truck?" She nodded. "Didn't stay long. Maybe 30 minutes? What company?" I couldn't tell. "What did they move?" "Boxes." "What kind of boxes?" "I don't know." She looked uncomfortable. "I just figured you knew about it." "No." Her face changed immediately. "Oh." She set the watering can down. "Honey, you didn't know." I shook my head slowly. "No." Miss D looked back toward my house. "Your brother was here." My heart skipped. "And his wife? Did they go inside?" She didn't answer right away. Finally. "They used a key." I walked into the house as calmly as I could. Mom sat on the couch watching television. She smiled. "You're home early." "I am." I set my keys on the table. "Where's Nora? Sleeping?" I nodded. "Good." Then I asked the question. "Why was Brent here today?" She didn't even flinch. "They stopped by. With a moving truck." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Miss Dolores talks too much. So it's true. They brought a few things. A few things. Just children's toys." I stared at her. "They moved belongings into my house." She shrugged. "They're only temporary." "You let them move things into my house while I was at work." "They're family." "So am I." Carol folded her arms. "You always make everything sound so legal." "Because it was legal. Or rather, it should have been." Without another word, I walked upstairs. The nursery door stood closed. Exactly where I'd left it. Except, the tiny ribbon I'd tied around the doorknob before leaving had been removed, not broken. Untied, then tied again, carefully. Someone had gone inside. My pulse quickened. I unlocked the door. Everything looked normal. Almost. The rocking chair sat 2 inches farther from the window. The diaper basket had been turned sideways. One drawer wasn't completely closed. Little things. Tiny things. The sort of details most people would never notice. But nurses notice details. That's our job. I slowly opened the closet. On the floor sat 2 cardboard boxes. Neither belonged to me. One was labeled Meso 1 Winter COCS, the other read TOYs. For several seconds, I simply stared. Someone had already begun moving another child's belongings into my daughter's nursery. Without asking, without permission, without even pretending to respect me, I carried both boxes downstairs, dropped them in front of my mother. "What are these?" She looked down casually. "They're Masons. I can read." Silence. I asked what they're doing in my baby's room. "They'll need somewhere eventually." "No. They'll need somewhere eventually." I pushed the boxes toward the front door. "They'll need somewhere else." The Carol stood. "You are being unbelievably selfish." The word hit harder than I expected. Selfish. The woman who'd housed her mother rent-free for 2 years. The woman who'd loaned Brent money he never repaid. The woman who worked Christmas after Christmas so coworkers with children could stay home. Selfish. I almost laughed. Instead, I opened the front door, picked up both boxes, and placed them carefully on the porch. Not thrown. Not damaged. Just outside. When I came back in, my mother looked horrified. "You put your nephew's things outside." I returned them. "They'll get wet." "Then Brent should come get them." "You've changed." I looked at Nora sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. Then back at my mother. "No. I finally stopped pretending. That evening Brent called. He didn't say hello. What the hell is wrong with you? I could ask you the same question. You embarrassed Kayla. I wasn't aware my nursery was open for storage. They're just boxes. No, they're boundaries. He laughed bitterly. You've been talking to that neighbor again? No. I've been thinking. Mom says hormones are making you emotional. That did it. For years I'd ignored the excuses, the dismissals, the minimizing. Not anymore. My hormones didn't buy this house. Silence. My mortgage did. Before he could answer, I hung up. For the first time in my life, I hung up first, and strangely, it felt wonderful. The following morning, Miss D knocked before breakfast. She held 2 cups of coffee. I figured you might need this. I smiled gratefully. You always know. She handed me 1 cup, then glanced toward the street. I've lived here 38 years. Okay. I've watched families build each other. She paused. And I've watched families consume each other. I didn't speak. She rested one gentle hand on my shoulder. Honey, they're counting on your guilt, not your generosity. That sentence stayed with me all day. Because suddenly, everything made sense. They weren't asking. They were assuming I'd eventually surrender simply because I always had before. But there was one thing they didn't know. While everyone else had been making plans, I had quietly started making some of my own. Plans that involved a lawyer, the county recorder's office, and one document nobody in my family had bothered to read. And before another week was over, that single piece of paper would change everything. The following Thursday, after dropping Nora off with Rosa for the afternoon, I drove somewhere I hadn't planned to visit. The office of the attorney who had handled my home purchase 6 years earlier. His receptionist smiled politely. Can I help you? I hope so. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from David Mercer, the same real estate attorney who had slid the deed across the closing table all those years ago. He looked older now. More gray around the temples. He studied my face for a moment before speaking. You look worried. I think my family is trying to take my house. He didn't laugh. Didn't even look surprised. Instead, he folded his hands together. Start from the beginning. So I did. Every conversation, every assumption, every box that had mysteriously appeared in Nora's nursery. Every sentence my mother had spoken as though ownership didn't matter. When I finished, Mr. Mercer leaned back in his chair. Let me ask one simple question. Okay. Whose name is on the deed? Mine. Only yours. Yes, and whose name is on the mortgage? Mine. Anyone else ever added? No. He smiled. Then legally, this is one of the easiest questions I've answered all month. Relief washed over me, but only for a second. Then why do I still feel like I'm losing my house? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a yellow legal pad. Because this isn't a legal problem. He wrote 2 words. Family expectations. You've spent years teaching them that your answer will eventually become yes. I stared at the page. I never taught them that. He looked at me kindly. Didn't you? His question stung because I knew exactly what he meant. Every loan I never asked to be repaid. Every holiday I sacrificed. Every boundary I quietly abandoned to keep the peace. I'd never said the words, you can walk all over me. I'd simply lived them. Mr. Mercer slid a business card across the desk. If anyone enters your home without permission. He tapped the card. Call me before you call anyone else. I slipped it into my purse. Do you think it'll come to that? He looked at me for a long moment. I think people who believe something already belongs to them rarely stop on their own. Driving home, I couldn't shake his words. People who believe something already belongs to them. They weren't trying to steal my house. In their minds. It was already theirs. That realization frightened me more than anything. When I pulled into the driveway, my heart immediately sank. Brent's pickup truck sat in front of the garage. So did Kayla's SUV. Children's bicycles leaned against my porch railing. For one wild moment I wondered if I'd somehow forgotten what day it was. Maybe they'd come to visit. Maybe Mom had invited them for dinner. Then I noticed something else. The garage door was open. Brent was carrying boxes inside. Not out, inside. I parked hard enough that gravel sprayed beneath the tires. The moment Brent saw me, he froze. Kayla looked away. Even the kids stopped playing. I climbed out of the car. "What are you doing?" Brent forced a smile. "Just getting organized." "In whose house?" "Our future house." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. "No." His smile disappeared. "Mom already explained everything. My mother doesn't own this property. She's your mother. And she speaks for the family." I looked him directly in the eye. "She doesn't speak for me." Before either of them could answer, I picked up the nearest box. It was labeled kitchen. Everyday dishes. I carried it back to Brent's truck, set it carefully in the bed, then returned for the next one. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One by one darted every single box to the truck. Kayla finally broke the silence. "You're humiliating us." I stopped, slowly turned toward her. "No. You humiliated yourselves when you moved into someone's home without permission." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because there was nothing she could honestly say. My mother stormed out of the house. "Oilia!" I turned calmly. "What? What do you think you're doing? Returning property. You are acting like a stranger." "No. I'm acting like the homeowner." Her face hardened. "For years, this family has stood together." I looked around. Really looked. Brent, Kayla, their children, my mother, all standing together, on one side. Then I looked down at Nora sleeping peacefully in her stroller beside me. There were only two people standing on my side. My daughter, and me. Quietly, I answered, "No." This family has stood behind me while I carried everyone else. Nobody spoke. Because they all knew it was true. That night, after everyone finally left, I sat on the nursery floor while Nora slept in her crib. The room was peaceful again. Everything exactly where I'd left it. I rocked gently in the chair, thinking, remembering. For years I'd believed strength meant enduring. Taking one more hit, making one more sacrifice. Keeping everyone happy, but motherhood changes strange things inside a woman. When you become responsible for someone who cannot defend herself, you suddenly realize how little you've been defending yourself. I looked at Nora. "I don't want you growing up thinking love means surrender." The words echoed softly through the room. And for the first time, I understood that I wasn't fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for the example my daughter would one day remember. 2 mornings later, something arrived in the mailbox. A plain white envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, no signature, just one sentence. "Families who choose property over blood usually end up with neither." My hands went cold. It wasn't a legal notice. It wasn't even a threat. It was a warning. Someone wanted me afraid. Someone wanted me to believe standing my ground would cost me everyone I loved. I folded the paper carefully. Then I walked inside, opened the kitchen junk drawer, and placed it beneath the deed to my house, because from that moment forward, I intended to keep every piece of evidence. Something told me this wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. 3 days passed without a single phone call, no surprise visits, no emotional speeches, no guilt-filled text messages from my mother. The silence should have comforted me. Instead, it made me uneasy. Families like mine didn't simply give up. They regrouped. Monday morning began at 40:45 am. Nora was hungry. By 5:15, she'd finished her bottle and fallen asleep on my shoulder. One tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I stood in the kitchen watching the sunrise creep across the backyard. The maple tree outside was beginning to bloom. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone buzzed. "Mom," I stared at the screen. It rang until voicemail answered. 30 seconds later, another call. I ignored that one too. Then came the text. "We need to talk today." This has gone far enough. I slipped the phone into my pocket. For once. The conversation could wait. Later that morning, Rosa stopped by after finishing her shift. She carried coffee in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. "You look better," she said. "I slept 4 straight hours." She smiled. "That's practically a vacation." While Nora slept in her bassinet, I told Rosa about the anonymous letter. She read it twice, then folded it carefully. "This wasn't written by Brent." "You don't think so?" She shook her head. "No. Brent says exactly what he's thinking." "So, this came from someone who wants to sound reasonable." I immediately thought of my mother. Not because I could prove it, because it sounded exactly like her. Calm, measured, disappointed, never openly cruel, just quietly convincing you that your own feelings were unreasonable. Rosa watched my expression change. You know who wrote it? I think I do. You going to confront her? No. Why not? Because she'll deny it. And people like my mother don't lose arguments by admitting they're wrong. They lose them when facts leave no room to argue. Rosa smiled. There she is. Woo, the NITU nurse, I frowned. What do you mean? You've stopped reacting. She took a sip of coffee. Now you're gathering evidence. That afternoon I drove to an electronics store. An hour later I returned home carrying 3 small boxes. Security cameras, nothing fancy. Just enough to cover the front door, back patio driveway, and hallway leading toward the nursery. Miss D wandered across the street while I was reading the installation instructions. Planning something, I laughed. Planning not to wonder anymore. She nodded approvingly. Best money you'll spend. By sunset, every camera was connected to my phone. Motion alerts. Cloud backup. Night vision. As I tested each one, I couldn't help feeling guilty. Who installs cameras inside their own home because of family? Then another thought replaced it. Who forces their own daughter to? The first alert arrived at 8:43 that evening. Motion detected front porch. I opened the app. Brent stood outside. He didn't knock. Instead, he bent down, lifted the welcome mat, looked underneath, then frowned. I watched the recording twice. He'd been looking for a spare key. There wasn't one. There never had been. He stood there another minute before leaving. I saved the clip. The following afternoon, my mother arrived carrying 2 grocery bags. I brought soup. I already made dinner. It freezes. She smiled pleasantly. I'll just put it away. No. She blinked. What? I'll take it. For a second, something flashed across her face. Not anger, confusion. She wasn't accustomed to hearing that word from me. No. I don't need help putting groceries away. She laughed softly. Oilia, I'm serious. She reluctantly handed me the bags. As she stepped inside, I noticed her eyes moving. Kitchen, living room, hallway. She was looking for something. Or perhaps, looking to see whether something had changed. Where's Nora? Taking a nap. I'll peek in. No. Why not? Because she's sleeping. I won't wake her. I said no. The silence between us stretched longer than either of us expected. Finally, Mom smiled. You've become very protective. I looked straight at her. I've become a mother. That evening, after she'd gone home, I checked the camera footage. One clip caught my attention. While I'd been putting the groceries in the kitchen, my mother had quietly stepped into the hallway. She hadn't gone toward the bathroom. She hadn't looked into the living room. She'd stopped directly outside the nursery door, reached for the knob, turned it locked. She stood there for almost 10 seconds. Then calmly walked away before I returned. She never mentioned it, never asked why it was locked. But now I knew she had expected to walk right in. Wednesday brought another surprise. Miss D knocked on my door just after lunch. Honey. She looked uneasy. I think you should see something. Across the street, parked beneath the oak trees, sat Brent's truck. Empty. No one inside. What about it? It was here last night. I frowned. What time? Little after 11. I wasn't home. I know. I had worked an overnight shift. Rosa had stayed with Nora. Miss D lowered her voice. He wasn't alone. Who was with him? She looked directly at me. Your mother? My pulse quickened. They sat out there almost 40 minutes. Doing what? Watching your house. The words settled over me like ice water. Watching. Not visiting, watching. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every shadow seemed different. Around 2 a.m, I gave up trying. I walked quietly into Nora's room. Moonlight spilled across the pale blue walls. She slept peacefully, one tiny fist tucked beneath her cheek. I sat in the rocking chair, thinking, remembering, planning. Somewhere outside, a car door closed. I froze. Another sound, soft footsteps. Not on the porch, in the backyard. I slowly opened the camera app. The backyard camera activated. Nothing, just darkness. Then, movement. A flashlight. Someone was walking along my fence line, slowly. Deliberately. The figure disappeared behind the detached garage before the camera could capture a face. I immediately called the police non-emergency line. An officer arrived 20 minutes later. He searched the yard. Found fresh footprints beneath the nursery window. Large boot prints, Too large to be mine. He photographed them. Asked if I had enemies. I almost laughed. No. Then I corrected myself. I have family. The officer gave me a curious look. I've learned those aren't always different things. Before leaving, he handed me his card. If anything else happens. He glanced toward the nursery. Cal immediately. The next morning I reviewed every second of overnight footage. At 20:11 a.m., the camera caught someone entering through the back gate. At 20:13, the same figure stopped beneath Nora's bedroom window. At 20:16, the person looked directly toward the camera. The hood shifted, just enough. My breath caught. I recognized the face. Not because it was clear, because I'd known it my entire life, and suddenly, everything became far more dangerous than I had imagined. I watched the footage 3 more times before I accepted what I was seeing. The hood concealed most of the person's face. The porch light only caught them for a fraction of a second, but I didn't need perfect lighting. I recognized the way they walked, their slight limp, the habit of keeping one hand tucked into a jacket pocket. I'd watched that walk my entire childhood. My mother, Carol Owens. I sat frozen at the kitchen table while the video replayed again. 2:11 a.m. she entered through the side gate. 2:13 a.m. she stopped beneath Nora's nursery window. 20:15 a.m. she looked inside, then slowly walked around the house, checking every door before disappearing into the darkness. She never tried to force her way inside. She simply inspected, like someone checking on property they believed already belonged to them. That thought chilled me more than anything. I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. Instead, I called David Mercer. I have security footage. What kind? My mother was walking around my house at 2 a.m. Silence. Then, save multiple copies. I already have. Good. And Oilia. Yes. Don't warn anyone you have cameras. Why? Because people tell the truth when they think nobody's watching. That Saturday, our family attended the same church we'd gone to for nearly 30 years. Normally, I sat beside my mother. This week, I chose a pew near the back with Nora asleep in her carrier. People noticed. Small town churches notice everything. After the service, Mrs. Peterson smiled as she admired Nora. She's getting so big. Too fast. We laughed. Then another familiar voice interrupted, still keeping her away from her grandmother. Brent. His smile looked friendly. His eyes didn't. I answered calmly. No. I'm keeping her close to her mother. Several people nearby suddenly became interested in the conversation. Brent shrugged dramatically. Mom's heartbroken. I looked at him. Rayleigh. She cries every night. About what? You tearing this family apart. A few heads turned. Exactly what he wanted. He wasn't talking to me anymore. He was performing for an audience. I glanced around the church lobby. People pretended not to listen, which meant every single one of them was listening. Brent sighed loudly. We've tried everything. I smiled politely. Everything except respecting my answer. His jaw tightened. See. He gestured toward me. This is what she's become. Mrs. Peterson frowned. What exactly happened? Brent answered before I could. Oilia won't let Mom see the baby. That wasn't true. Not even close. But lies spoken confidently often arrive before truth has time to tie its shoes. Before I could respond, another voice spoke. Now that's interesting. Everyone turned. Miss D. She stood near the entrance holding her purse. Apparently she'd attended the later service. She smiled sweetly, because I seemed to remember Carol spending almost every afternoon at Oilia's house. Silence. Miss D. continued. I also remember Carol having her own bedroom there. More silence. And unless my memory's failing. She looked directly at Brent. Wasn't your sister the one paying every bill? Nobody answered. Because nobody could. Brent's performance had suddenly lost its script. Miss D wasn't finished. It's a funny thing about generosity. She adjusted her glasses. People miss it most after it's gone. Then she walked away, leaving behind complete silence. On the drive home, I couldn't stop smiling. Not because Brent had been embarrassed. Because for the first time in my life, someone else had spoken before I had to defend myself. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd been until someone stood beside me. Monday brought another surprise. An envelope waited in my mailbox. This one had a return address. A law office. For one terrifying second, I thought Brent had hired an attorney. Instead, it was from David Mercer, Inside was a neatly organized folder. Copies of everything related to my house. The deed, the mortgage, the property survey, insurance information, and one typed letter. Keep these somewhere outside your home. If anyone attempts to claim residency without permission, call me immediately before allowing them to stay. At the bottom, he'd handwritten one sentence. Preparation isn't aggression. It's wisdom. I folded the note carefully, then placed the folder inside a safe deposit box at my bank that very afternoon. Something told me I'd eventually be glad I had. The next few weeks settled into an uneasy routine. Work, feed Nora, sleep when possible, ignore increasingly dramatic messages from family. Mom alternated between guilt. I've sacrificed everything for you. Ever in disappointment. I never imagined my own daughter would abandon family. Then came anger. You've changed since having that baby. No, I hadn't changed. Motherhood hadn't made me selfish. It had made me responsible. There was a difference. One evening, Rosa looked at me across the hospital cafeteria. You know what's bothering your mother most? What? She keeps losing. I'm not trying to beat her, I know, but she thinks every boundary is an argument. Rosa smiled. The problem is every time you calmly say no, she hears herself losing control. I'd never thought of it that way. Control, not love, not concern, control. Late Friday afternoon, I arrived home after a 12-hour shift. The front porch looked normal. The flower pots, the welcome mat, the rocking chair. Everything exactly where I'd left it, until I unlocked the front door. A strange smell drifted through the hallway. Fresh paint. My stomach dropped. I hurried toward the nursery. The moment I opened the door, I couldn't breathe. The soft blue walls I'd spent weeks painting before Nora was born were gone. Someone had painted over them. Bright yellow. The curtains I'd sewn myself had disappeared. The framed prints of woodland animals were missing. The name above the crib, Nora, had been taken down. In its place, leaning against the wall, was a cardboard box. Across the front, written in thick black marker Messinus Rome, my knees nearly gave way. Someone hadn't just entered the nursery. They had erased my daughter from it. And according to the motion alert on my phone, the cameras had recorded every single second. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The nursery door remained open behind me, but it felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't another box quietly left in a corner. Someone had walked into my daughter's room while I was working to provide for her and decided she no longer belonged there. I slowly crossed the room. My fingers brushed the freshly painted wall. The paint was still slightly tacky. It couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I looked around. The little cloud decals I'd carefully placed above Nora's crib were gone. The handmade quilt Rosa's mother had sewn had disappeared. Even the rocking chair had been moved to the opposite wall. Every trace of my daughter had been erased. Except the crib. Even they hadn't been bold enough to move that. Yet my phone vibrated. Motion alert saved successfully. With trembling hands, I opened the security app. 3 separate recordings waited. 10:02 a.m., 7:42 a.m., 20:07 p.m. I pressed play. The first video showed my mother's car pulling into the driveway. She stepped out carrying a ring of keys. Not groceries, not baby supplies, keys. A minute later, Brent's pickup arrived. Then Kayla's SUV. All 3 of them walked toward my front door. Carol unlocked it. Not knocked. Unlocked it. My heart pounded. When had she gotten a key? I had never given her one. The second recording came from the hallway camera. It showed them carrying paint cans upstairs. Drop cloths, rollers, boxes. Children laughing as they raced down the hallway. My home, like they already lived there. Then the nursery door opened. For nearly 40 minutes, people walked in and out. Some carried decorations. Others removed them. At one point, Kayla carefully lifted the wooden letters that spelled Nora from the wall. She smiled, placed them inside a trash bag, then reached into another box. She held up colorful dinosaur decals. Brent nodded approvingly. They began placing them on the freshly painted yellow walls. My stomach twisted. The final recording hurt the most. After everyone else had left the room, my mother remained behind. She stood beside Nora's crib, ran one hand along the railing, then quietly said something. The camera had no audio, but I knew my mother well enough to read her lips. It's for the best. and she turned off the light, closed the nursery door, and walked away. I didn't cry. Not then. There would be time for tears later. Right now, I needed facts. I called the police. Officer Daniels arrived 25 minutes later. The same officer who had investigated the footprints outside the nursery. He walked through the room carefully, taking photographs, making notes, examining the paint cans left behind in the trash. Finally, he looked at me. "Do you know who did this?" Instead of answering, I handed him my phone. He watched every recording without speaking. When the final video ended, he removed his glasses. "Mrs. Owen, they had permission to enter. No, they have keys. They shouldn't." He nodded slowly. "This changes things." Downstairs, he asked another question. "Is anything missing?" I thought about it. "My daughter's name." He looked confused. I managed a tired smile. "I'll show you." We searched the garage, the basement, storage closets, nothing. Then Officer Daniels opened the large outdoor trash bin. Inside, buried beneath paint rollers and empty pizza boxes, lay the wooden letters, NORA, covered in yellow paint. Something inside me finally broke. I carefully picked them up, wiped them clean with the corner of my sweater, held them against my chest. Officer Daniels quietly looked away, giving me privacy. Some kindnesses are silent. That evening, David Mercer arrived, not because he had to, because he insisted. He watched the footage, read the police report, walked through every room, then stopped in the kitchen. "Do you still want your mother living here?" The question landed heavily. For 2 years, that downstairs bedroom had been hers. I'd imagined she'd grow old in this house, that Nora would remember her grandmother baking cookies on Sunday afternoons. Instead, I remembered yellow paint, thrown away memories, a nursery renamed for someone else's child. I looked toward the staircase. "No," Mr. Mercer nodded once. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached into his briefcase, removed several documents. "I prepared these just in case." "What are they?" "A formal notice terminating her permission to live here." I stared at the papers. "So, I'm evicting my own mother." "Nundu," he corrected me gently. "You're asking an adult who no longer respects your home to leave." There was a difference, a very important difference. The next morning, I knocked on the downstairs bedroom door. "Mum," no answer. I knocked again. She opened the door wearing her robe. "What?" I handed her the envelope. She glanced at it casually, until she read the first line. Then her face changed. "What it is?" "A notice." "You can't be serious." "I am." "You'd throw your own mother out." I took a slow breath. "No. I've asked the woman who painted over her granddaughter's nursery to move." Her expression hardened instantly. "So that's how you're telling the story." "It's how the cameras told it." Silence. Absolute silence. For the first time, my mother looked genuinely frightened. "Cameras? Every hallway, every entrance, every room that matters." She stared at me. "You recorded me?" "No," I answered quietly. "You recorded yourself." She sank into a kitchen chair. For nearly a minute neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something I never expected. "I didn't think you'd mind." I blinked. "What?" "It was only paint." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because the sentence was unbelievable. It wasn't paint. It was my daughter's first room. It was months of dreaming. It was the only place in this house built entirely for her. You erased her. I was making room for family. I looked directly into her eyes. So was I. Then I glanced toward the stairs. "And you still don't understand which family comes first." That afternoon, as movers began carrying my mother's furniture toward the truck she had reluctantly rented, neighbors quietly stepped outside. No one pointed. No one whispered loudly enough to be heard, but everyone watched. Miss D walked across the street carrying a pie. She set it on my kitchen counter, then hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry." "I know. You doing okay?" I looked through the window. My mother refused to look back at the house. "No," I admitted. "But I will be." Miss D smiled. Sometimes peace arrives looking exactly like heartbreak. Across the street, Carol climbed into the passenger seat of Brent's truck. Before closing the door, she finally looked back. Not at me. At the house. The house she'd spent weeks insisting belonged to the family. She shook her head, as though she still believed I was the one making the mistake. She had no idea. The biggest surprise of all was still waiting for her, because she hadn't yet discovered what had been filed 6 years earlier at the county recorder's office. One signature. One legal document. One decision I'd made before anyone imagined this battle, and when she finally learned the truth, she would drop her phone right onto my front walkway. My mother moved out on a Thursday. By Saturday afternoon, half the people at church had already heard a version of the story. According to the rumors, I had forced a grieving widow onto the street. I'd supposedly become cold after having a baby. Some versions even claimed I'd changed the locks while my mother was grocery shopping. It would have been almost funny if I hadn't known exactly where those stories came from. People like my mother never called it lying. They called it sharing their side. The problem was, their side never had room for the truth. Sunday morning arrived warm and clear. I almost stayed home. The thought of smiling politely while people whispered behind my back sounded exhausting. But hiding would only confirm every rumor. So I dressed Nora in the little white dress Rosa had bought her after she was born. It had tiny embroidered daisies around the collar. When I fastened the last button, she looked up at me with those impossibly serious gray, blue eyes. "You ready?" She answered with a hiccup. I laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." The sanctuary felt different the moment I walked inside. Conversations paused, then quietly resumed. People smiled, but some smiles were tighter than usual, more curious than friendly. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my arm. "We've been praying for your family." "Thank you." She hesitated. "I hope everything works itself out." "So do I?" Neither of us mentioned what everyone was really thinking. After the service, Brent intercepted me near the fellowship hall. Kayla stood beside him. My mother lingered several feet behind them, speaking quietly with 2 women from the choir. She didn't look at me. Not once. Brent folded his arms. "We need to settle this." "There isn't anything to settle." "There is if you want this family to survive." I adjusted Nora's blanket. "The family survived just fine while I paid everyone's bills." His jaw tightened. "You don't have to keep throwing money in people's faces." "I never did." I looked directly at him. "But you seem determined to pretend it never existed." Kayla finally spoke. "The kids keep asking when they're moving." I blinked. "You already told them they were." She looked uncomfortable. "What thought?" "You thought wrong." Her shoulders dropped. For the first time, I almost felt sorry for her. Not because she was innocent, because she'd believed promises that had never belonged to her husband to make. Before anyone could say another word, my mother walked over. Her smile was gentle, practiced. The same smile she'd worn at funerals and church picnics for years. "Let's not do this here." I nodded. "I agree. Come home this afternoon. There is no home to come to." She frowned. "You know what I mean." "No. I know what you wish you meant." A flicker of irritation crossed her face. "You've become disrespectful." "No. I've become honest." People nearby pretended to study the bulletin board. No one left. No one interrupted. They were listening. Every single one of them. My mother lowered her voice. "I don't want strangers hearing family business." I glanced around. "They already have." She followed my gaze. Only then did she realize half the fellowship hall had quietly stopped talking. She straightened her shoulders. "Fine. If you're determined to embarrass us, I'm not embarrassing anyone." "You've done that yourself." Her expression hardened. "So you're choosing a house over your own family." There it was. The question she'd been building toward for weeks. I looked at Nora sleeping peacefully in her carrier. Then back at my mother. "No. I'm choosing my daughter." Silence. Complete silence. I will never teach her that love means surrendering everything she owns. For a second, even my mother had no response. Miss D, who had been pouring coffee across the room, smiled quietly to herself. Later she'd tell me she'd been waiting 30 years to hear someone finally answer Carol Owens. That afternoon I expected peace. Instead, at exactly 17 p.m., my security camera sent a notification. Motion detected front driveway. I opened the app. 3 vehicles, Brent's truck, Kayla's SUV, a rented moving van. My pulse quickened. I looked outside. They weren't there. The camera feed was live. They were at my house. While I was still driving home from church, I pressed harder on the gas pedal. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "No," I whispered. "No." 10 minutes later I turned onto Marigold Lane. The moving truck stood open in my driveway. Boxes lined the sidewalk. Brent was directing 2 hired movers toward my front porch. Kayla held a clipboard. My mother stood beneath the maple tree calmly giving directions. It looked like moving day for them. I slammed the car into park. Before I even opened the door, Brent waved cheerfully. "There you are." I stared at him. "What are you doing?" "We're getting started." "Started with what?" "The move." I honestly wondered if I'd lost my mind. "We've already had this conversation." A mom stepped forward. "We've had several conversations." "No. You've ignored several answers." One of the movers approached politely. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. They told us this was a family move." I smiled apologetically. "They lied." His face changed immediately. "They said they owned the property." "I do." He looked at Brent, then back at me. "You have identification." Without a word, I walked to my car, opened my purse, removed the folder David Mercer had told me never to travel without. Inside was a certified copy of my deed. I handed it to the mover. He read the first page, then slowly looked at Brent. "Sir, I think we need to stop." Brent's face turned bright red. "This is ridiculous." The moving company supervisor had already walked over. He studied the deed, then asked one simple question. "Is your name anywhere on this document?" Brent didn't answer. Because he couldn't. The supervisor turned to his crew. "Load everything back into the truck." One mover asked quietly, "What about the furniture?" "Nothing comes off this truck." He handed the paperwork back to me. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am. It wasn't yours." I looked at Brent. It was theirs. My mother finally lost her composure. "This house was meant for family." I looked directly at her. "It is." Then I placed one hand gently on Nora's carrier. "My family." As the moving truck slowly pulled away, the entire neighborhood had gathered outside. No one said a word, but everyone had seen enough. For the first time, the truth wasn't whispered. It had witnesses. For almost a week after the moving company left, everything was quiet. Too quiet. No unexpected phone calls, no handwritten letters, no surprise visits. Even my mother's daily texts had stopped. If someone had asked me then, I probably would have said the worst was over. I should have known better. People who spend years believing they're entitled to something don't suddenly accept losing it. Sometimes they become desperate. It happened on a Wednesday. I had agreed to pick up an extra 12-hour shift because one of our nurses had come down with pneumonia. Rosa offered to keep Nora overnight. "You need the sleep more than you need to prove you can do everything yourself," she teased. She wasn't wrong. By 7 that evening, I kissed Nora goodnight at Rosa's house and drove to the hospital. As always, I checked my security cameras before clocking in. Everything looked normal. The porch lights glowed softly. The living room was dark. The nursery door was closed. I locked my phone and went to work. Around 10:30 in the morning, while I was helping stabilize premature twins born almost 8 weeks early, my phone vibrated in my scrub pocket. Motion detected front door. I ignored it. Another alert, then another. By the time we had both babies settled, my phone showed 17 missed notifications. My stomach tightened. I stepped into the staff lounge and opened the app. The first recording began. At 12:01 a.m., a familiar sedan pulled into my driveway, my mother's. Seconds later, Brent's truck arrived. Then Kayla's SUV. 3 adults climbed out, no children, no moving truck, just flashlights. My pulse quickened. The front camera showed them walking to the porch. Brent reached into his pocket. He pulled out a key. My heart stopped. The locks. I had changed every lock after my mother moved out. How? Then I remembered. The back door. The locksmith had replaced the front and side locks. The back door had been delayed because the special order hadn't arrived until the following week. I had completely forgotten. Brent slid the key into the back lock. The door opened. They walked inside. I immediately called 911. "My name is Oilia Owens. My family is breaking into my house." The dispatcher asked if anyone was inside. "No. My infant is safe. But they're trespassing." She assured me officers were already on the way. Those 7 minutes felt longer than some entire shifts in the NCU. I watched the cameras helplessly. Unable to leave, unable to stop them. The hallway camera activated. Carol walked directly toward the stairs. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she was going. Straight to Nora's nursery. Brent followed carrying a toolbox. Kayla carried large trash bags. My chest tightened. What are they doing? The nursery camera answered. Carol stood in the center of the room for a long moment. She slowly turned in a circle, almost like she was saying goodbye. Then Brent began removing furniture. The rocking chair, the bookshelf, the changing table. Everything was carried into the hallway. Kayla folded Nora's blankets. Instead of placing them neatly in a box, she stuffed them into black trash bags. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Then Carol walked to the crib. She rested both hands on the railing. Even without audio, I could see her talking. She smiled sadly. Then, she reached down, unfastened the little wooden sign hanging from the crib. Dream big, little one. A gift from Rosa. She handed it to Brent. He dropped it into the trash bag. Something inside me snapped. I called Miss D. She answered on the second ring. Honey, look outside. What? My family is inside my house. She didn't ask another question. She simply said, I'm going. The next camera showed her crossing the street in slippers and a bathrobe. She didn't look frightened. She looked furious. She marched up my front steps and pounded on the door so hard the wreath fell off. Inside, everyone froze. Brent looked toward the window. Carol shook her head. Ignore her. Miss D kept knocking. Then she shouted loudly enough for one of the outdoor microphones to capture every word. I know you're in there! Still no answer. Then she said something that made me smile despite everything. You've got about 30 seconds before half this neighborhood comes outside. She wasn't bluffing. Lights began turning on up and down Marigold Lane. Front doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto porches. Curtains moved. People looked toward my house. At exactly 1:03 a.m., police cruisers turned onto the street. Red and blue lights reflected across every window. The officers walked briskly to the front porch. They knocked once, twice, then loudly announced police department. 5 seconds later, the front door opened. Brent tried to smile. Officers, this is just a misunderstanding. One officer asked calmly. Do you live here? No. Does your name appear on the deed? No. Did the homeowner give you permission to enter? Brent looked toward my mother. Nobody answered. Carol finally spoke. I'm her mother. The officer nodded politely. I understand. Do you have permission to be inside the house? Silence. Another officer walked upstairs. Moments later he returned carrying one of the trash bags. He unzipped it. Inside lay Nora's blankets, her stuffed rabbit, her baby books, her framed footprints from the hospital. He looked at Carol. Were you removing property from the residence? Carol's face turned pale. It wasn't stealing. It's family. The officer answered gently. Mom. The law doesn't have a family exception. I arrived home just after sunrise. My shift had ended early after another nurse came in to relieve me. The police cars were gone. The street was quiet. Miss D waited on my porch holding a spare cup of coffee. She wrapped me in a hug before I could say a word. I tried. You did enough? No. She shook her head. I should have called you sooner. I smiled weakly. You called exactly when you needed to. Together, we walked inside. The nursery looked like a tornado had passed through. Furniture stood in the hallway. Closets were open. Drawers emptied. But the crib remained exactly where it had always been. Waiting for Nora, I walked over, placed one hand on the mattress, closed my eyes, and silently promised my daughter something. No one would ever make her feel unwanted in her own home. Not while I was breathing. As I stepped back into the hallway, Officer Daniels approached with a folder in his hand. We recovered this from your kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a typed notice. Addressed to me. It read effective immediately. This residence is being reclaimed for the Owens family. Please remove all personal belongings by Sunday morning. There was no legal authority, no court order, no signature. Just certainty. I looked up slowly. Sunday morning. I remembered the opening words my mother had spoken weeks earlier. And suddenly, I understood exactly what they had planned. They hadn't intended to ask me to leave. They intended to make it appear that I already had. Sunday arrived bright and warm. The kind of spring morning that usually smelled like fresh grass and possibility. Instead, it smelled like the end of something. I woke before sunrise. Not because I had to. Because I couldn't sleep. Nora stirred softly in her crib while birds sang outside her nursery window. I lifted her carefully into my arms. She blinked up at me with sleepy eyes before resting her head beneath my chin. I kissed her forehead. "You don't know it yet," I whispered. "But today changes everything." By 8 o'clock I was ready, not for a fight, for the truth. David Mercer had arrived just after 7. He placed a slim folder on my dining room table. Inside were certified copies of every legal document connected to the house. The original deed, the mortgage, property tax records, insurance documents, and one additional filing, one I'd completed nearly 5 years earlier after buying the house. A filing no one in my family had ever known existed. Mr. Mercer smiled. "Still sure you want to do this yourself?" I nodded. "I've spent my whole life letting people speak for me." I looked toward the front window. Today, they can finally hear my voice. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the first vehicle pulled into my driveway. Brent's pickup, then Kyla, then my mother. Within minutes, 3 more cars arrived. Aunt Ruth, Aunt Denise, 2 cousins, even a family friend from church. I watched quietly through the upstairs bedroom window. Nobody knocked. Nobody looked uncertain. They walked across my lawn carrying cardboard boxes. One even carried a folded tape measure, as though they had come to help someone move. Only, the someone they expected to move was me. My security cameras showed every angle. Brent walked confidently onto the porch. He knocked once. No answer. He smiled. "Wes, she's already gone." Kayla looked relieved. "I told you she wouldn't make a scene." Mom folded her arms. I knew she'd come to her senses. I almost laughed. For weeks, they'd mistaken my silence for surrender. They had no idea I was standing 10 feet away, watching everything unfold on the monitor in my kitchen. Brent tried the doorknob. Locked. He knocked harder. Still nothing. My aunt looked nervous. "Shouldn't we wait?" Mom shook her head. "No. She's expecting us." "No, Mom. I thought I'm prepared for you. There's a difference." Brent pulled a key from his pocket. The same old key. The one that no longer fit any lock on my house. He pushed it into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. He tried again. Nothing, then harder. Still nothing. Confusion spread across his face. "That's strange." Mom frowned. "It should work." I finally decided they'd waited long enough. I tapped one button on my phone. The outdoor intercom connected to every security camera. A soft chime sounded across the porch. Everyone looked around. Then my voice came through the speaker. Clear, calm, steady. "Good morning." Every head snapped upward. Brent looked directly at the camera above the porch light. "Oilia, I can see all of you." Silence. "You came early." Mom stepped closer. "We're here to help." "No." I answered quietly. "You're here to take something that doesn't belong to you." She forced a patient smile. "Please stop being dramatic." "There it is," I said almost sadly. "My favorite sentence." She frowned. "What?" "You're being dramatic. You've said it every time I disagreed with you since I was a little girl." No one spoke. "I was dramatic when I wanted to go to nursing school instead of staying close to home. I was dramatic when I worked holidays. I was dramatic when I bought this house. I was dramatic when I became a mother." I paused. "The only thing I've never been is wrong." Brent stepped forward. "So that's it? You're choosing a building over blood." I smiled. "No. I'm choosing respect over entitlement." He shook his head. "You've destroyed this family." I looked down at the monitor showing Nora asleep peacefully upstairs. "No. I stopped allowing it to destroy me." David Mercer stepped onto the front porch from inside the house. The family hadn't even realized he was there. He carried the folder beneath one arm. My mother's confidence disappeared. "Who are you?" "My name is David Mercer. I'm Mrs. Owen's attorney." His calm voice carried across the quiet street. "I've been asked to deliver something." He handed Carol a sealed envelope. She frowned. "What is this?" "A formal notice." She opened it impatiently. As she read, the color slowly drained from her face. Brent looked over her shoulder. "What does it say?" She didn't answer. Her hands had begun to shake. David spoke for her. "It confirms that Mrs. Oilia Owens is the sole legal owner of this property. We know that." Brent snapped. "No." David corrected him. "You assumed temporary generosity created permanent rights." It does not. Then he removed another document from the folder. And this, he held it up, was filed with the county recorder 5 years ago. My mother stared. I don't understand. David smiled politely. I know. I pressed the intercom again. This is the part everyone forgot. When Dad died, I invited Mom to live here because she needed help. I didn't give her ownership. I gave her kindness. I took a slow breath. And kindness isn't inherited. David unfolded the final document. 5 years earlier, after buying the house, I'd signed a transfer on death deed. It stated that if anything ever happened to me, the house would pass directly to Nora, held safely in trust until she became an adult. No one else, no siblings, no extended family, no claims, no confusion, just my daughter. My mother's eyes widened. What? I continued through the intercom. I filed it long before Nora was born. After she arrived, I updated the beneficiary. Everything I own goes to my daughter. If something happens to me, no one standing on that porch will ever own this house. Carol stared at the paper, as though it had been written in another language. She looked from the document to the house, back to the document, then at the security camera. But, she whispered, this was supposed to stay in the family. I answered gently. It is. My family. She reached into her purse for her phone. Her hands were trembling so badly that she couldn't grip it. The phone slipped from her fingers. It struck the stone walkway with a loud crack. Exactly where I'd imagined it would. For one strange second, no one moved. Then Miss D walked across the street carrying her morning coffee. She smiled at the gathering. Looks like y'all picked the wrong house. Nobody answered, because there was nothing left to say. One by one, cars began pulling away. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just quiet defeat. Brent left first, Kayla followed. My aunts avoided looking toward the house. Carol remained standing on the sidewalk the longest. She looked smaller somehow, older, not angry anymore, just lost. Before climbing into her car, she looked toward the camera one final time. I really thought. Her voice broke. I was doing the right thing. I answered honestly. That's what makes it so sad. She nodded once, then drove away. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Children rode bicycles. Dogs barked. Sprinklers turned on. Life continued. Inside the house, I walked upstairs to Nora's nursery. Sunlight poured through the windows. The pale blue walls glowed softly. The wooden letters spelling her name hung exactly where they belonged. Enorata. I sat in the rocking chair with her sleeping peacefully in my arms. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet. Not empty, peaceful. There's a difference. I finally understood what Miss D had meant all those years ago. A woman who buys her own house doesn't just buy walls and a roof. She buys the right to decide who enters, who stays, and who leaves. Most importantly, she teaches her children that love should never require surrendering your dignity. Nora stirred in her sleep. Tiny fingers wrapped around mine. I smiled. This, I whispered. This is what home feels like.